Oh, Tessa, the chat should not be turned off. We'll need to figure out what is going on. So if the chat is turned off, can the Colorlines team do some troubleshooting so that folks will be able to speak to us and to each other? I'm not sure what's happening, and I am not the most technologically advanced person, but we will figure that out. And so Rona and Tessa, we got you. We're going to figure that out. Ziamara, yes, hello. How are you? I am so excited to be here. I am Charlene Sinclair, the editor of Colorlines, and I am so excited that folks have decided to join us this evening. We plan to have an incredibly stimulating conversation, and we are deeply, deeply honored to be in this partnership with the AAPI Civic Engagement Fund and their team, who will be in the chat engaging with you. Unsuk, Jenny, and Chelsea, they have been amazing partners to put this together. And we have our Color Lines team that will also be here. And you've been hearing from our Color Lines team through a lot of our content that we've been developing. So we've got myself and Priscilla and Damon, Terrican, Devon, and Jessica and Clem. I know I must have missed someone, but I think I got the mighty team. So we are all happy to be here with you. So let's get started. The chat is now working. Yay. You can definitely talk back. But please be kind to me. If you're going to talk in the chat, don't get nasty with me. There are people that talk in the chat and they just don't know how to behave themselves. So I know you are not those kind of folks, and we are excited that you're here. So let's get started because we are in an incredibly important moment. And I'm really privileged to have Dr. Claire Jean Kim with us. Dr. Claire Jean Kim was introduced to Colorlines by our friends at the AAPI Civic Engagement Fund. And through that, we were able to really dive deep into her work and said, this is a conversation that we must have at Colorlines. Colorlines is committed to really engaging rigorous study around issues of democracy, race, and power. And we felt that this was a timely discussion and an important discussion. And so we're really glad to have Dr. Claire Jean Kim with us. Before we get started, I want to do a bit of housekeeping and then also bring another dear friend to Colorlines into the space to also help us get situated. So how we're going to do this time together. We are scheduled to talk with Dr. Kim from Claire. I'm going to say Claire because Claire tells me I can be a bit formal. So, but it is so hard for people to get their PhD and to be a woman and to be a woman of color that I like to honor that. So I'll just say Dr. Claire. So so Dr. Claire tells me I don't need to be formal, but I want to be respectful of the hard work that she's done. Before we get there, we are going to have Connie Kapam. I always get Connie's name wrong. Connie Kapamgang. I know I did it wrong. Connie Heller. Connie Kapong, she'll get me right. If I don't have it in front of me, I mess it up. Heller, come into the room and talk to us. One thing that we really, really want to do at Colorlines is to recognize that different people actually engage their senses in a variety of different ways. And as a result of that, we make sure that we not only have the written word, but we engage in oral conversations and we engage in visual art and music and spoken word, so that there are multiple ways in which people can engage us. So if you've been following Colorlines, that you know that Connie Kapong Pom Pong Heller, I'm gonna get it right, because I'm determined, is a brilliant, brilliant artist that utilizes her study and her deep questions to create provocative and very emotive art around issues of empire, power, race, belonging. And so Connie had done a piece of work and as a part of a series called Seeing Across Difference. And when we decided to do this body of work, it really asked her if we could engage her in a conversation around a piece that is a part of that series entitled Yuri and Malcolm X. And so we had an extensive conversation, and Connie will come and join us for a few minutes because it turns out that Connie is also the chair of the advisory council for the AAPI Civic Engagement Fund. So, so Connie will join us shortly. Then we will have Dr. Claire and I in conversation with each other. At any point, we've got folks that are in the chat with you and in the Q&A. When questions come up, please just ask them. We want this to be a robust conversation. So please just ask your questions as they come up. And in addition to that, we also know that in a room, in a webinar, even if you have the ability to be in the chat or if you have the ability to be in the Q&A, it's not like being in conversation with people. So when we close at 7, we will put a link in the chat. And if you want to be in conversation for another 30 minutes or so, we will open up a Zoom meeting room so that everyone can just have an opportunity to see each other, to talk with each other, because we do want to try to foster community conversations. And so that is how our time will go while we're here. And so now I would like to bring Connie into the room, and so that she can share with you all this amazing piece of art and some of why and how she does this work. And Tessa, I think you need to change your chat to everyone. And right now it's host and panelists, so we can see, but everyone can't see. So for folks that might be, let's see if we can help Tessa and others change that so everyone can see each other's chat. Thank you. Now, Connie, can you please enter in with me and be gracious that I mangled your name, because I am actually a little bit tired.
Hi, Charlene. I do not mind if somebody mangles my name, but it's Connie Kagampong Heller. And I am so honored to have been asked to share a piece of my art as a prelude to this conversation between two of my most admired scholars, both of whom have deeply informed and shaped my work and practice, whether they know it or not. So while I've made art as long as I can remember, it was when I started to learn about structural racism that I got serious about making art. I was learning so much and frankly needed a way to process the ideas and the concepts. And I began to use my own experiences and the experiences of my family as a starting point from which to ask questions. And importantly, as I read more and learned to see more, recognize more, and ask more questions, I needed to find ways to visualize hope and possibility. So I made this piece entitled Yuri and Malcolm a few years after I learned about the photo taken by Earl Grant that was printed in Life magazine. In the photo, Yuri Kochiyama comforts Malcolm X in the moments after his assassination. At the time, her presence in the photo confused the American public. Who is this Asian woman beside Malcolm X? How did she come to be in a Black church in Harlem? Why did she run to be by his side? Soon after, I realized that a number of films had been made in which Asian American women activists who in life had stood with and for Black liberation were cast as Black women in the fictionalized films made about the events. In a white supremacist society, this recasting plays into white supremacy and misses an important opportunity. So in this context, Yuri and Malcolm's relationship represents two things for me. First, it reveals the significance and power of authentic relationship across difference in a white supremacist society. And second, how important it is for us as Asian Americans to recognize our structural interconnectedness with Black Americans while simultaneously acknowledging the significance of our differences. So Charlene, it's back to you.
Thank you so much. Let me introduce Dr. Claire Jean Kim and talk a bit about why this becomes so important. You know, one of the reasons why I wanted to engage with both Connie and Dr. Claire is because they both go on journeys. You know, they both take very seriously the historic arc of this country, and they take very seriously the idea that you have to engage race from a perspective that deeply looks at the structure of white supremacy and the structure of Blackness and anti-Blackness as a mechanism for both structuring and stabilizing white supremacy here in the US and across the world. And so I really, in many, as I said, many of us look at and have our openings in different ways. And so I really hope that as a part of this conversation, the both the art and the conversation and Dr. Claire's forthcoming book will be a starting point, a continuation, or a yes affirmation for folks, but it will matter to you all. And so I say, welcome, Dr. Claire Jean Kim. It is such an honor and a pleasure to be in conversation with you. And we are so glad you are here.
So much, Charlene. I'm going to have to beg you to drop the doctor part, please. I appreciate the sentiment, but yes. Yeah, I want to start by thanking you, Charlene, and also Unsuk, for just being tremendous, inspirational, brilliant women. I just think you're both amazing. It's been such a joy to work with you both, and I really feel fortunate to be in this conversation with you.
Thank you so much. One of the things that I want to do just right off the bat, because you have written a very provocative book. And for our folks, our Colorlines folks, the book isn't even out yet. So we're talking about your work and the evolution of your work that has manifested itself in this critical piece of writing. Can you give us that central thesis of the work so that folks here can understand what you are trying to activate in their consciousness?
Sure. So one of the things I want to talk about, jumping off of your comments, Charlene, is that the book, borrowing from work in Black Studies, starting with but not ending with Professor Lewis Gordon, is the emphasis on two forces being at work at the same time in shaping the US racial order. One is white supremacy and one is anti-Blackness. So usually scholars tend to talk about one or the other of these, but I actually in my book say both are operating and are articulating with one another. So that's the challenge, to understand how they're both at work. So let me define the terms just very simply in very physical, almost hydraulic terms, so that it's easy for people to just grab onto immediately. White supremacy we can think of as a force that lifts white people up and pushes down all not white people. Anti-Blackness, on the other hand, pushes down Black people and lifts up all not Black people, right? So you immediately can see Asian Americans, as our other groups, are in an odd position in this configuration. So the central thesis is of the book is that Asian Americans are seen from the moment they first arrive in large numbers in the 1850s till today as not white, but above all not Black. And this means they are seen as the lesser of two evils as compared with Black Americans by white people, by the power structure. This also means that Asian Americans benefit from anti-Blackness, right? They're one of the groups that is lifted up by anti-Blackness. So if we just talk about white supremacy and focus on how all not white groups are pushed down, we're missing a key part of the dynamic, which is the lifting up of not Black groups. Mm-hmm. One of the important sub-theses is that the system will tend to do things for Asian Americans as a not Black group, rather than do things for Black people. So one of the challenges of understanding anti-Blackness is understanding that, again, borrowing from Frank Wilderson and many other scholars in Black studies, is anti-Blackness refers to a structural or foundational feature of society and of the world. And what it describes is our inheritance from centuries of racial slavery. The inheritance is that our worlds, our psychic, emotional, political, social, economic worlds are built around the phobic hatred and avoidance of Blackness. That's sort of the central dynamic going on. And other racial dynamics are going on as well, but that's the central one. And so once we think about that and we think about the fact that the US is ostensibly a racial democracy, ostensibly a place where, you know, liberty, equality, et cetera, prevail, we see the dilemma for the US state, right? Which is that it's in a perpetual legitimacy crisis because it is in fact an anti-Black state, but it is always posing as something that is as an entity that is racially neutral. So in that context, Asian Americans come to be weaponized by the US state against the Black struggle. They come to be used as an alibi for the state and for society. Every time the US state does something positive for Asian Americans, they can say, look, we are anti-racist, as they're taking, right, as they're taking hits from criticism from the Black struggle. Their answer is to do something for Asian Americans. I think a good example of this would be the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, which was just passed a year or two ago in the context of COVID-19. So my book really asks, how have Asian Americans been positioned in this way as alibis, as for the US racial state, weaponized by the state against the Black struggle? How have they played along with this? How have they sought to challenge this? And what does the future hold in terms of the 21st century? How will Asian Americans choose to position themselves in the fight against anti-Blackness?
Yeah. Now there was a lot in there, so I want to parse them out in some pieces. One is starting with even your utilization of language. You don't say non-Black, you say not Black. And so that's a deliberate choice. And so can we talk about why that choice? What are you trying to convey with that?
Thank you for asking that, Charlene. No one's ever asked me that, and it is deliberate. And the reason I choose it is because when we say non-Black, it sounds as though someone is incidentally, right, not Black. But not Black shows the level of repudiation going on the part of the person who is embracing that status, right? So as Asian Americans historically have distanced from Blackness, they have declared themselves not Black, right? I don't mean literally using those words, but that's what they're trying to say. And given that the society is based around the phobic avoidance of Blackness, not Blackness becomes a property, right? Almost as good as whiteness, not quite, but it's a form of property. It will get you into better neighborhoods, better schools, get you hired, etc. So I use the not as opposed to non to emphasize the level of repudiation going on.
I appreciate that, because now when you talk about the repudiation, and you also talked about the phobic being psychic and spiritual as well as economic and political, which is unusual for folks to talk about, like the totality of the human experience. And so can you talk a little bit about that as well?
Yes, and that is due to the influence on my work from Black study scholars, and also from especially those scholars who are working on Frantz Fanon, the philosopher psychiatrist from Martinique, and his theories, because as a psychiatrist philosopher, Fanon talked about people's psychic worlds as well as the political, historical, social world. So he insisted on an integration of all of those things, and people in Black studies, particularly radical Black studies in like the last several decades, have taken up Fanon and themselves also insisted on that kind of more holistic analysis. And so I'm trying to borrow from that and follow that example.
Yeah, I appreciate that, because I'm a big Fanonian myself, and what we tend not to do, and I think this is important in your work, is to understand that psychic engagement, the ways in which you are mentally shaped through these processes, require deep undoing. And the part of right at the center of your work is the call for a deep undoing, right? It is. And so that's what makes it in my mind, one of the most challenging books here, because what we tend to do is to have people say, well, if you could just identify with someone else's problem, then you have empathy for someone else's problem, then there's a way in which you can work together. And you're calling for something harder than even that. That's hard enough, but you're calling for something even harder, because
Mhm.
in your work, when you talk about Asian Americans in an anti-Black world, you're saying, if I get this right, and I want you to correct me if I don't, and really expound upon it, is that we are required to engage anti-Blackness, not to figure out how we might experience some of the sub effects of discrimination, but we are required to really understand it in order for us to destabilize it. And destabilization is critical for us to even get anywhere near some level of solidarity, if at all, if we can even get there at all. So just curious about some of that work, because that's hard work you're doing. And it cannot be easy. And I'm sure people are like, well, look, we've been through some stuff, we should be able to talk about our stuff. And so real curious about how people are reacting to this call, this provocative call that you're making.
I think destabilize, yes. And I raised the question because Asian Americanness was constituted starting in the 1850s through the present as an anti-Black position in the US racial order, as people who are not Black and therefore entitled to certain kinds of protections and immunities not extended to Black people. Because of that, the question I raise in the book, and I don't know the answer, but I realize it's a troubling question, is it possible that you can reconstitute Asian Americanness as a force that destabilizes anti-Blackness rather than as a force that reinforces it? In terms of the demand being placed on Asian Americans or other readers, I think that, there's an ethical demand that's at the heart of the book, right? Which is you simply can't talk about justice, racial justice, and not address anti-Blackness first and foremost and centrally, because otherwise you're just asking for racial justice for your own group, for yourself, and you're leaving the structure intact. And this is, in fact, historically what Asian American groups have sometimes done. And so it's interesting to look at that, as a historical example and say what can be done that's different from that. Also, I think in the long run, it does come back to Asian Americans cannot be free of the things that plague them, right? Of the things that affect them. For example, hate crimes, right? During COVID-19. Those kinds of things will persist as long as we are in an order structured by white supremacy and anti-Blackness. So in order to even for Asian Americans to recognize, to claim their full humanity, we too need to address anti-Blackness, because it's again a question of how do you dismantle the structure, not just how do you try to carve out a little piece for yourself.
Mhm. The question that I have is one around, as you as you talk about this work, what is the piece of your work that often gets misunderstood? As you make, these ethical
Mhm.
claims.
That's a heavy question.
Mhm.
And I'll be better equipped to answer when the book's been out a while and I hear some of the feedback. But I would say thus far, what have gotten from some folks who are my colleagues in ethnic studies, other race scholars, is a deep worry bordering on anxiety that the argument will make coalition building, make, people of color solidarity impossible, or somehow make it much more difficult. And my answer to that, and I do address this directly in the introduction to the book, is I'm trying to hold open space, right, to sort of push back on the third world solidarity framework just long enough so that we can hold open space to ask some of the questions that need asking about what is happening in the differential in power and status between these two groups, and other groups as well, even though I don't address them in the book. And if we can hold open that space and address some of these questions as we're doing, for instance, now you and I in this conversation, then I think it makes the possibility of coalition work down the line more real, more authentic, and more, potentially more deep rooted and long lasting, because you can't have coalition building on the basis of historical untruths.
I think that's one of the things that emerged as we were talking and preparing for this conversation was that I read footnotes. And so, it was in the footnotes where you really talked about this piece and talked about the tendency for folks to actually believe that, wait, if we don't give the opportunity for different communities to speak to their different oppression, are we not doing oppression Olympics and saying, this group has suffered more than this other group? But that's not what you are saying. You're talking about a historically structured reality that that is anchored on the particularity of anti-Blackness. And can we, through that, understand enough to recognize how it structures other realities, right? And if we can't do that, then it becomes difficult to even undo the harm against all of us, right? Much less create some mechanism for coming together for power to actually change society writ large. And I think that's so important. Go right ahead.
How can not Black groups contribute to the dismantling of anti-Blackness, structural anti-Blackness, if they don't recognize what it is, or don't recognize its reach, its depth, its power? Without that kind of understanding, then there it can be no effective coalition building, right? I think there can be no effective politics against anti-Blackness without that. So I think it's just a very important kind of initial step to think about some of these issues. And as you said, it's not about trying to say certain groups are more important than others. It's about trying to understand how the structure as a whole works and how much all of our lives are built upon the abjection of Blackness. And that has been true because of centuries of racial slavery. And many Americans think that's something that's in the past and they want it to stay there, and it's not at all in the past.
Mhm. I want to have you talk a little bit about your own journey, because I do think that one of the things that I've also appreciated is that you didn't simply arrive at this analysis. It is a part of an iteration of study in some very deliberate ways in which you have approached this work. And here at Colorlines, we really are committed to a love and rigor framework, and so want to hear you speak to that journey and that evolution, because it's powerful to know that you don't have to stay in a particular place. Like you should evolve, right? And two, it requires real work. So tell us a little bit about your journey.
Sure thing. I like to actually put up some of my earlier work on the screen for my class and have my students discuss it and critique it. And they're always a little hesitant because they think I'm the author, so I'm not going to like it if they critique it. But the point is to then say, and this is where I started in my thinking, and this is where I've moved to. And these were the intervening steps. Because to me, if you're a scholar or a thinker, an activist, and you're not growing and developing your ideas, then that's something to be concerned about. So but the main intervention for me was realizing I had to educate myself, because through reading in Black studies, because really I made it all the way through college as a political science major and almost all the way through graduate school with nary a treatment of slavery, anti-Blackness, any of it. So by the time I was out of school, I realized this is something I need to understand as a race scholar. So I began, what has been a many year effort to educate myself. And this is why I think it's so vital for us to fight to preserve people's access to what, the right is calling critical race studies. There's such an attack on these curricular programs now, at the state level. Many states are banning access, and it's very alarming. And also the controversy over the 1619 project, right? Any attempt to educate the US population about slavery, is beaten back, and people are immediately vilified for undertaking that attempt. So, why is that? There's a reason for it, and it's because the way that power operates in an anti-Black society, all of that is only sustainable if the majority of the population remains in the dark about what anti-Blackness is, what the inheritance of slavery is, what Saidiya Hartman calls the afterlife of slavery. If the population remains in the dark, then when things like reparations come up, they don't understand that issue. They say, why do we need to worry about reparations, right? So it's only if people understand the role that race, particularly anti-Blackness, has played, continues to play in shaping all of our lives in the most profound way, that they will be open to change. And that's exactly what, those in power don't want to happen.
Mhm. Yeah, I really appreciate that. In your work, um, and thank you for mentioning Sadia Hartman's work, because similarly in your work, you don't shy away from uh, the very harsh reality of that historic arc. You illustrate in detail, that reality. And again, a deliberate move on your part, right? A lot of people hearken to it was awful, or there was violence, or I mean, you literally illustrate through your words what was encountered. And so what led you to actually at such deep in such detail and at great length um unpack the history of Blackness and anti-Blackness and the violence that was wrought against it?
One of the reasons I felt I needed to speak about that violence pretty extensively in the first part of the book is to set the context for understanding Asian American violence against Asian Americans, right? So in Asian American history, typically people start with the Chinese immigrant laborers in the 1800s, and they will say increasingly scholars in Asian American studies are taking more seriously the context of slavery and Reconstruction, et cetera, and Jim Crow, and they are bringing that into the analysis more powerfully. Historically, that has not been the case. So it's as if in Asian American history, you have white people and you have Asian immigrants, and that's it, right? I mean, the rest, the context of the racial order is sort of erased or blotted out to some extent. So I think it's very important to bring that in, and we can't understand, like, just to give you a more specific example, we can't understand what the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II means unless we are looking at it against the context or within the context of anti-Black lynching, right? It's the lynching of Black people after Reconstruction, for nearly 100 years and ongoing, but the systematic nature of the lynching and the extreme, almost unspeakable brutality of that practice that helped to recreate slavery in, almost recreate it in another form by another name. Without that context, we can't look at Japanese American internment, those 3 or 4 years of incarceration, and understand what they mean.
Mhm. Well, let's talk about I think I got caught by a couple of questions in the chat, because I do think that, part of it is that you can't understand Japanese internment. And in the chat, there's a question about affirmative action and what is happening. So it's that you can't understand that either, you're saying in your book, if you don't understand this history. And so talk a little bit about that, because it's not only that you can't understand the harshness that happens with other communities, that you can't understand how these communities then can be weaponized to stabilize the structures that also still mean them harm. And so would you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I closed the book with an analysis of the Harvard affirmative action case. There's also the UNC affirmative action case. That's a public institution. It's a slightly different case. But and as you all probably know, the Supreme Court is about to hand down a ruling, probably maybe within the next few days, maybe within the next few weeks. And most people anticipate, despite the recent ruling on the Voting Rights Act, that the court will somehow rule against Harvard's affirmative action plan, whether in part or entirely. So it really seems like affirmative action is sort of teetering on the edge, as it has been, honestly, since its inception many decades ago, because it was always in the sights of the right wing from the very beginning. Why? Because even from the very beginning, it was the only policy that actually had started with some sort of redistributive or remedial inspiration, right? Even though the Bakke court, right, the Supreme Court in the case of Bakke in 1978 shifted the rationale of affirmative action from remediation or remedying social discrimination to diversity, promoting diversity, still there has, there's a sense in which affirmative action is about justice. It's about trying to remedy in however slight a way all of the harm that is visited upon Black people and also some other groups in an anti-Black society. So I think the affirmative action case is so important because Asian Americans, for the first time, are the plaintiffs in this case. So at the first time at the Supreme Court level, it's Asian Americans bringing a case against a university saying affirmative action, and it's paradigmatically seen as a pro-Black policy. Affirmative action is harming Asian Americans in the name of helping Black people. And it's not just Asian Americans who are behind this. It is partly Chinese, conservative Chinese, affluent Chinese immigrants, and it's partly Ed Blum, right, and his billionaire conservative white donors who backed Shelby County v. Holder and many other ventures. So this convergence, right, this dovetailing of conservative Chinese immigrant politics and white right-wing politics has produced this particular case. And what we're seeing argued by the Chinese Americans organizations who support the case is that Asian Americans are the worst off group, that they have been the most discriminated group in the US in terms of history and in the present, because this is how the argument goes. They are taking it from both sides. They get discriminated against by white people, and at the same time, they have Black people advocating things like affirmative action, which burden them, right? So they actually compare advocates of affirmative action to white segregationists during Jim Crow. And they compare themselves to the Black children, for example, who were, who integrated schools in the South after Brown v. Board of Education. So what we're seeing is a real, is conservative Asian Americans really taking Black history, appropriating it for their own uses, evacuating it of Black people, putting themselves in that history, using the moral authority of that history, and making alliances with white far right wing white conservatives to bring down a policy which has had a significant but modest effect on racial justice in this country.
Mhm. I'm watching some of the conversation in the chat that is just completely lighting up around this, because I do think that it is top of mind for a lot of people. And your example also shows that if you're not clear about that historic arc, and if you're not clear about whose interest is being served, then your interest that is being served could actually be serving a larger structural interest that is diametrically opposed to you. And so I think that is the piece that is so interesting about what you said. It reminds me of, I wish I could think of the book now, but it talks about lynching, and that what we see are, the everyday people that are part of the process, but behind that is an entire structure that demands that kind of violence to uphold itself.
Yes.
Right. And so that's the piece that we tend not to see, and that you're calling us to see. What is the structure behind that is holding all of this up? And if we don't understand that it exists, and that a deep structuring force of it is anti-Blackness, then we end up actually being a proponent for that structure itself, all in the name of taking care of our community. And
Yes,
that's important. Go ahead.
and I'd like to also raise that the people, the conservative Chinese immigrant groups who are mostly quite affluent from advantaged backgrounds, that they are arguing about they're worried that Harvard is discriminating against Asian American applicants on this sort of the soft personal ratings, right? Where places where parts of the admissions process where people can be somewhat subjective, like admissions officers interviewing you or an alumnus interviewing you or a letter from a guidance counselor. And they assert that the hard figures of like SAT scores and grades, those are objective, right? Those are what we should stick with if we are truly going to be a meritocracy. Those figures are not objective. Those figures do not reflect a meritocracy. Those figures reflect class and race segregation, right? Those figures reflect class and race inequality. I mean, this much scholars have shown us very clearly that people who do better on the SATs, which by the way are not predictive of college success in any significant way, but people who do better on the SATs do so because their parents have enough money to get them into prep classes, right? And they don't have to do extra jobs on the side, so they have more time. So we see the class and race privilege, which are very closely tied together, reproduced in so many aspects of the admissions process. And yet these Asian American parents are focusing only on the question of whether those personal ratings show any subjective, bias against Asian Americans, as if the other indicators being used are objectively reflective of some kind of merit. So it's an opportunity for us to look at the U.S. higher educational system and say we need to be rethinking the impact of race and class on the whole system, and how these schools, ultimately become gatekeepers, like they're grooming an elite to rule society, and they're keeping other people out, and reproducing patterns of inequality that are very destructive in the long run.
Yeah, I have a question here that is a direct follow-up to what you've just said. Can you offer any thoughts about the potential roles of the idea of color blindness or in meritocracy discourses, and how they contribute to this gap that you reference in your work as well? I should actually talk about the gap that you reference, and can you talk about that a little bit?
So Eduardo Bonilla Silva has some important scholarship on the issue of what he calls colorblind racism. That is the evocation or invocation of the idea of colorblindness as a way of sort of suppressing genuine, meaningful debate about racial injustice. Because of course the official line is we are supposed to be a colorblind society. We embrace colorblind norms, at least since the civil rights movement. Whatever problems we have that remain are aberrational, but we're trying really hard and we're making good progress. So that whole triumphalist, teleological, historical narrative is what we all are, bombarded with in school and in even in college and by the media. And so we may come to actually believe those ideas, but they're not accurate. And colorblindness has come to be, even though it was used by Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights activists as a way of, pushing back against Jim Crow, since then has been appropriated, that discourse, by people on the right who are saying, we need to stop having affirmative action. We need to stop thinking about reparations or issues like that, any remedies for racial injustice, because we need to just focus on being colorblind. And always when that is raised in discourse, that is a way of saying we just don't want to look at the existing racial inequalities before us. And I would say at a deeper level, we don't want to look at how the whole world is organized around the phobic avoidance and hatred of Blackness. That's a very profound realization to have, right? If you read in Black studies and you come to that understanding, it's world shaking, it's world shattering. You have to rearrange things, you have to reorient yourself after that. And that's something that people don't want to do. It's a lot easier to talk about as a liberal, color blindness, meritocracy, and the Chinese American parents who are behind the Harvard lawsuit. They believe in meritocracy, they believe in color blindness, and they use those terms to mean we Chinese people have been discriminated against more than Black people. We're not asking for handouts. We're not asking for help. We just want you to stop standing in our way, right? Stop putting ceilings or quotas that limit Asian Americans. Just clear out of our way, and we can do it on our own through hard work. That is a blatant disavowal of the kinds of privileges, the kinds of structural advantages that Asian Americans have relative to Black people. I'm not saying that they have advantages relative to white people, and I'm not saying they're all equally advantaged with one another, because they're not. And I'm not saying that immigrants come to this country, and are handed a pot of cash or, handed a deed to a house. These things are not true. They work hard, but so do Black people. And so the issue is not who's working hard, right? The issue is the deck stacked against Black people? And the answer is yes. And that metaphor, maybe I should stop using because it's too trivializing of the truth, which is, again, the organization of our lives and our minds and our hearts around the hatred of Blackness.
Mm-hmm. I think that is it is extremely powerful when you say that, when you talk about the phobic hatred, right? Because, and I think it's important that you are saying it, because if a Black person talks about anti-Blackness, then it is, look, as you said earlier in your talk, we are past that. Slavery was so long ago. I've got Black people in my neighborhood. I go to school with Black people. And, and again, I'll keep saying this over and over again, the power of your work is that you're calling on people not to engage in an interpersonal conversation, and not even an interracial conversation. You're talking about a real structural conversation. You're talking about how the political economy of society is structured around this. And I think that your contribution to this conversation is indeed critical. And more people need to be in this conversation in order for us to even open it up. And if you ask folks, would you be Black? So that the not Black really caught me, because if you were to really ask folks and they answer very seriously, would you be Black in this country? And if they were to answer honestly, they would get closer to the kind of analysis you're insisting that we have, and so deeply appreciate that. And so we've been talking about the hardness of this issue, and I'm just wondering if there are any bright lights that you see, and it's okay if you don't, just wondering, if there's anything that has a sliver that if we pry it open a bit, it might matter.
In principle, I resist that kind of question, Charlene, because I'm always expected, people, I guess, think the story's a downer, and then they expect me or hope that at the end I'll say something uplifting so that everyone can walk away. I know that's not what you're doing, because that's not your project, but I have just this sort of visceral reaction against being asked to say anything hopeful, but I will say a few things. One is, an organization like the AAPI Civic Engagement Fund, and working with UNSIC, honestly, I've been surprised and delighted by how much interest and support there is for thinking through these issues together. And and I don't just mean in a self-interested way, like highlighting my work. I mean, just that they're really under Unsuk's leadership, wanting to struggle, wanting to get through these issues. That surprised me to some extent and really been wonderful. And if I look back at the 1960s, I mean, I talk about this in my book. You know, there were a few Japanese American writers and thinkers. I'm thinking of Amy Uematsu and Alan Nishio, and they, looking back at some of their writing from the Asian American movement, you know, they saw anti-blackness. They didn't use the term. People in Black studies weren't using the term either. The Black Panthers weren't using the term yet, but um, or you know, at all yet. People were not using the term, but they were still naming this differential in status and power between Black people and other groups of color, and doing so in their writing. And so there's this moment at the beginning of the movement where if you're reading back, you're thinking there's that opening, right? There's that opening to go in a different direction. And that's not where the movement on the whole ends up going. And Yuri Kochiyama is, you know, in many ways an outlier, right? She is not representative, I would say, of the efforts of most of the people in the movement. So, you know, and I can already hear the arguments around that statement. So, you know, I'll acknowledge that's an arguable point. But my point is really that there are moments of this. There are some Asian Americans who want to challenge the conservative Chinese American groups that are trying to bring down affirmative action. And I think the book is in some ways a call to them to step up, to step forward and say, look, just saying Asian Americans are in solidarity with Black people is not enough. You know, just saying we are minorities too, we benefit from affirmative action too, is not enough. There needs to be something more, some way that Asian Americans can step forward and say, we reject and repudiate everything coming from these groups, these right-wing groups that are making nice with, you know, pro-Trump white groups. And we are calling out anti-Blackness, and we are reversing, right, a history of disavowing anti-Blackness. And we want to reorient our politics so that that anti-Blackness is front and center. And there are some groups like Asian Americans, Asians for Black Lives is an example of an online group that has put Black politics, anti-Blackness front and center. So one sees those glimmers. You're talking about slivers and glimmers. They're there. And I'm hoping the book will help the conversation to get more Asian Americans and others into thinking about what more needs to be done than is being done.
Mhm. You know, as we head towards the closure of our time together, you know, and this conversation has truly inspired people. You know, I know we've been talking and you can't see all of the ways in which the conversation is happening in the chat, but I mean, people are really engaging in multiple ways. And we are at a point where we are being confronted by the possibility of the Supreme Court decision this week or next week. And I do think that this has been an important conversation to sort of center how we might engage in analysis around that, regardless of what is said, right? And so the last question that I have for you before we close is really what sort of like what should we be saying to ourselves each day, you know, because some of the unlearning it requires, you know, putting new
Yeah.
stuff in, and if we can begin to put new stuff in to ourselves, then it we've developed the muscle of that. And
Mhm.
so really curious about what is that thing you want to lead people with,
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
you really want them to engage with, and build muscle around. And
Mhm.
so, and
Yeah,
take your time, because
that's a big one.
that's
Yeah.
a big one. Yeah.
Before I forget, I do want to say that I would like to redo this event with me asking you questions, because I have so much to learn from you. I'm just amazed by you, Charlene. And I just think people would learn a lot if I sat and interviewed you. So maybe we could think about that in the future.
Let's think
Yeah.
about that. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I think, you know, a, I think thinking about anti-Blackness every day. Because for those of us who are not Black, it is an option not to think about it. And one can go one's whole life exercising that option. And it is very, challenging to think about it as a not Black person, in part because you're not sure what you can do, in part because no one around you is thinking about it. So, there are a lot of ways that it's difficult, but to not let yourself listen to a talk like this, read a book in Black studies, and then simply let it slip out of your mind, but to try to cultivate, as Yuri and Malcolm would want you to do, a political consciousness that is lasting and that grows, so that you start to understand your place in the world, and you start to understand how power is structured in the world and what it might take to actually challenge it. And it does take, a certain kind of uncomfortable vigilance from all of us all the time. And I would say every day, every time you walk into a social setting, for example, you can look around yourself and say, how is this enabled by anti-Blackness? How does it express anti-Blackness, right? Beginning with maybe residential segregation and who gets to be at the social setting, at the social outing, right? So if you dig deep enough, and you don't have to dig very deep, you can find the evidence of structural anti-Blackness at work in whatever you are doing. And I can say this of myself in my own daily life. I can see it around me all the time. So to tune into that and not stop tuning into it.
Mhm. Thank you so much, Claire. Thank you so much.
Thank
It
you, Charlene.
really has been amazing to not just this conversation that we're having right now, but the fact that you were willing to lean in and have this conversation meant that we were able to have several and have started a conversation partner like friendship that's like this. We need a little sign language or something, say me and you, girl. So this has been, a wonderful conversation. We want to be able to invite folks who have been lighting up the chat and that want to be in conversation to join the meeting room, the Zoom meeting room. If Terrican or one of my colleagues from Colorlines will put the link inside the chat, please join us over there. Claire will join us over there, and we can just continue to chat for a little while. We'll keep the room open until 7:30, and want to thank everyone for joining us, everyone for engaging. Clearly, you coming here means that you want to ask yourself these questions and be in this conversation with yourself, with your friends, family, colleagues. And we are so happy that you decided to spend this time with us. And so, Claire, once again, thank you. Big
Thank you,
shout out
Charlene.
to Unsuk and Jenny
Mhm.
and Chelsea, Connie from the AAPI Civic Engagement Fund. And what a wonderful, wonderful partnership. And I'm so glad that we are now in each other's community. And so thank you all very much, Colorlines and all of the sponsor groups and everyone that has shown up. And we will close down the webinar now, and we'll head over to the Zoom room. Claire and I are going to sit here because now we can't even see the link yet. Can you see the link? Do you have the link?
I can
Okay,
see it. Yeah.
good. We'll see
All
you
right.
over there, y'all.
All right.
Okay, bye-bye. Am I the only one that can't see this link?
I'll send it to you now.
Thank you.